Welcome to this week's video lecture for History 3326 online, Modern African History. Our subject for this week is fighting the slave trade. So last week we saw the emergence of the global slave trades, the transatlantic slave trade, the trans-Saharan slave trade, and the Indian Ocean slave trade. And really when we're looking at all of these slave trades in totality, what we're seeing is that the rest of the world is sort of descending upon Africa all simultaneously as a source of free labor for their other territories. And ultimately, this is going to have some devastating impacts on Africa. But of the three global trades, none of them is as critical as the transatlantic slave trade. Because ultimately what we're seeing with the Atlantic slave trade is that the volume is much higher and it's going to be happening much more fast and more furiously. And so ultimately these sorts of territories that are going to be engaging within the Atlantic slave trade are going to be undergoing some of the most drastic changes. And that's usually occurring from the late 1600s to the early to mid 1800s. And so that's really sort of the focus time-wise what we're dealing with for this week. And really the overall takeaway of this week's lecture is we need to understand that African actors are not sitting idly by, waiting for the slave trade to come and take over their communities. What we're ultimately seeing is that all of these African societies in one way or another are trying to adapt and respond to the changing circumstances that the slave trade is going to be bringing around. So there are four main methods of resistance, and we'll be talking about those at the tail end of this video lecture. First, I just want to go over some of the basic changes that we're seeing occur in Africa's coastal territories as they're engaging with European trade partners in the Atlantic slave trade. So, first and foremost, with the Atlantic slave trade, we are seeing a number of states get thrown into flux based on their relationships or lack thereof with European trade partners. We are going to see the rise of certain states based on their relationship with European slave traders, mostly because they're going to be gaining access to guns, a point I'll be talking about here shortly. But we're also seeing that the slave trade is functional at collapsing other more powerful states. Those who are in a better position to do business with the Europeans, despite the fact that they might not locally be the most powerful community, they are going to use those relationships to subvert the locally powerful sorts of empires and kingdoms we're seeing. So the first factor that the Atlantic slave trade is going to usher in coastal Africa is the rise of some states and the fall of others. Next, as I said, the flooding of guns into Africa. This is the commodity that Africans are most actively seeking throughout the slave trade. And there's a number of reasons for that. Really, most importantly is more guns equals more slaves, and more slaves equals more money. They're using these guns to become more powerful locally so that they can raid neighboring communities and take slaves to meet this rising demand at the coast. And that's another thing I want to point out, is that the demand at the coast is really just destroying a lot of internal factors that are playing into the slave trade at this time. Because Africans, like most other people in world history, are looking to try and get access to the greatest amount of resources. And at this point in time, being aligned with the slave trade means access to more resources. So, with the flooding of guns into Africa, we see a total subversion of the local economy. You're starting to see in areas like Ghana, where you have the Asante or Ashanti Empire, they are going to be actually engaging heavily in producing through blacksmiths and repairing their own weaponry. What that's going to do is it's going to put them slightly ahead of other states who rely solely on European trade partners to bring in weapons. And those communities are also throwing weapons out when they break. Whereas the Asante are going to be able to reorganize their local economy and their metalworking economy to be able to produce and to repair these guns. And that's why we see the growth of the Asante Empire during the slave trade. Now, also what we're going to see here is that with a higher rate of guns coming in and a higher rate of slave production going on, indigenous slave systems change. They become much less benign. We looked at the idea of the slavery to kinship continuum, where slaves were basically absorbed within a corporate kinship network. They're absorbed mostly into a familial network, so that after a few generations at most, their family will be integrated and will have a network within the community in which they were originally enslaved. That is going to change. With the emergence of the Atlantic slave trade as well, slavery becomes much more inhumane, much more brutal in Africa. And that really, ironically, it might sort of be counterintuitive to us. That's going to pick up after 1800 and once the push for abolition comes from Europeans. Because what's happening is that as the slave trade is abolished in the Atlantic, the domestic states on the coast of Africa still have huge numbers of slaves. And they are going to be employing huge numbers of slaves in order to procure more slaves. And so ultimately what happens is when the slave trade goes away, you still have a high number of enslaved individuals in the coastal communities of Africa. That again is going to force them, once the slave trade is gone, to rethink their position and reorganize their economy. What we're going to see is a lot of states that would traditionally keep slaves out of political power are going to be forced to allow slaves into political power. And that's something we'll see clearly in a future lecture when I'm talking about King Jaja of Apobo. His example is a very clear sort of example of this trend playing out. But also what we're seeing is that you start to see the emergence of more plantation-style slavery. When slave states in Africa were procuring slaves to sell into the Atlantic, they would come through, stop in the community for a small period of time. Really, the slave traders at the coast are what you could call middlemen. And then those people would shortly thereafter be sold into the Atlantic market. But now what you see happening is the domestic markets are retaining these people, and so they have to figure out something to do with all this excess labor. They're not procuring slaves anymore. So you will see the emergence of some limited plantation-style agriculture coming up in areas of coastal Africa where slaves are being retained domestically. So that overall is the sort of change that we're going to see going on within the slave systems and the societies that are engaged with the slave trade in coastal Africa. Now, there is this concept out there that there are predator states and prey states in Africa. Now, obviously, the sort of understanding here is that some states are going to be providing slaves to the slave trade, and those people are going to be the ones going out and basically actively capturing slaves in the interior of Africa and selling them to coastal trade partners. Those are traditionally called predator states. And the prey states are generally the interior people who are being taken and forced into the Atlantic slave trade. And as that's happening, what we're seeing as the slave trade goes on, as the demand shifts at the coast, as the circumstances change over time, it's important to understand that predator and prey states are not mutually exclusive. That a predator state can ultimately become a prey state and vice versa. Prey states can actively start engaging in the slave trade themselves, procuring more guns, and then they will ultimately become a predator state due to that engagement with Atlantic trade. So I just wanted to point out, before we jump into those methods of resistance, that when you're looking at predator and prey states, it's important not to think that at every point in time throughout the history of the slave trade, you're either a predator state or a prey state. It is possible to be both. We're talking about hundreds of years playing out here. So people are going to adapt and people are going to change. In particular, you have the case of the Balanta of the Upper Guinea coast. They are going to actively start planting rice in their area and using the rice agriculture to sell slaves. There's a particular area of the southern United States, at basically South Carolina and coastal Georgia. Those areas want rice agriculturalists. So they're trading actively in the Upper Guinea coast, because those people know how to grow rice. And they are going to be the ones transporting that technology across the Atlantic. It's their understanding of rice agriculture that's going to build out this new economy in the New World. But the Balanta are going to actively trade these rice agriculturalists for more weapons and more iron technology, things like hoes and different sorts of farming tools, things to till the soil, things of that nature. So ultimately what you're going to see is that they are going to be going from a very small prey state and turning themselves into a large predator state through the procurement of guns, because they had the type of slaves that Europeans were looking for at a certain point in the Atlantic slave trade. Mostly at the end of the 17th century is where you're seeing a heavy trade from that region. Now, that brings us to the topic for this week, which is methods of resistance to Atlantic-style slave raiding and slave trading. And there's four main methods of resistance, and these are what you really want to be able to draw out of this week's lecture. Number one, communities would naturally seek to defend themselves. What this meant was erecting structures that they could use to get a high line of sight to see the area surrounding their village so that they could look for slave raiders coming to take advantage of their territory. Secondly, they would be building walled sort of structures. They'd have these big, long spikes with the points facing outward so that people could not enter through the community without going through a gate. That way they could control who comes in and who comes out. They're also using sentinels, basically, people who are set up to be, again, at a high vantage point, who can see slave raiders coming and watch over any agricultural fields that the people are trying to tend to ensure that people aren't stolen or taken away from their communities while they're out doing work. So when we look at these sorts of things, these can be called defensive mechanisms. You're building fortifications. You're building high level of sight structures that will allow you to survey the land and make sure that you can stop a slave raid before it happens. So that is the first method of resistance. The second one is going to be migration. For those states that are being heavily preyed upon, who don't have the resources or the ability to construct defensive fortifications, what you're ultimately going to see them doing is trying to leave whatever territory they're in that is putting them in a position to be a prey state for the Atlantic slave trade, and it's going to force them to move away. And a lot of times what we're seeing here is people are moving out of open savanna land and into the heavily forested territories of the African continent. They're going deep into the forests, hoping that this will be able to hide them from the most active players within the slave trade. There also, you'll see, to a limited degree, where there are lakes and marshy territories, people are going to go up and build stilt houses and almost entire stilt communities. They're all built up on these high poles. And so they're out in the middle of the lake, and that makes it nearly impossible for the people who are coming in to take slaves to come in and raid them. So you'll often see people moving from a more agriculturally favorable position to a position that's simply more defensible, or one that is simply hidden from other slave raiders. So they will migrate away from their original territory. And a lot of times this has some unintended impacts. For communities that are used to living on dry land and using agricultural techniques that will work there, they're going to have to adapt their economy and their agricultural styles to fit this change, this migratory pattern. Now, the third method of resistance is what we call absorption. And what this is all about is, if you are a small prey community, there is a tradition in Africa of going to a larger, more powerful state and asking to basically become a protectorate of that state. You're going to become a member or a satellite member of their community. You're going to ask them for protection. You're going to ask them to absorb you into their cultural traditions, their linguistic traditions, and ultimately you're going to be doing this because you can be well defended if you're absorbed by this larger community. So people are willingly giving up their autonomy and moving into other larger communities where they're living as ethnic minorities as a means of escaping the slave trade as well. And that you can always remember that one by thinking there's power in numbers. And that's really what we're seeing there. Now, there's one final mechanism that's used to resist the slave trade and a lot of the things that that'll be coming as a result of the slave trade, and that is what we were already talking about with the Balanta. And that is prey states becoming predator states. Basically, it is offensive techniques. That means the acquisition of more rifles and guns from Europeans, and you are going to go on the offensive. If you are actively taking slaves, then you are no longer a prey state, you are a predator state. And so ultimately what we're going to see is people are using this technique to sort of make themselves central to the slave trade so that nobody will be messing with them. In other words, that the sort of thought process here is better to be a slave raider than the victim of a slave raid. And so that's ultimately the four methods of resistance that we're seeing in most of the coastal and interior African territories. And the idea is that European understandings of slavery and European models of slavery have now totally disrupted what it meant to be a slave in indigenous African society. And ultimately, people are going to have to react to that. We're going to see an overall economic impact that weakens Africa after the slave trade. And when you put all of this together, it's going to be a stepping stone that allows Europeans to start claiming African territory for themselves. And they will ultimately be turning those spheres of influence in which they had established good trade relationships and anti-slave trading treaty relationships after the abolition of Atlantic slavery. They're going to put all these things together to create their sphere of influence that they will ultimately mold into their formal colonies that we'll be encountering in the late 19th and early 20th century. So I hope this clears up the big picture for our topic for this week. As usual, if you have any questions or concerns, feel free to shoot me an email, and have a great week.